Alright everyone, welcome back to another video. Last time we left off with utopias in the backwoods, talking about little utopian areas in the backwoods of the United States. Well, interesting. We're now on to the birth of American literature. In the early 19th century, when American boastfulness was at its height, a liberal English clergyman, Sidney Smith, gave a word of caution. He asked, "Who buys American manufactured goods? And who reads an American book?" A generation later, no one would have asked this scornful question, for in the years before the Civil War, the United States produced literature of notable quality, read and admired on both sides of the Atlantic. The beginning of American literature centered in New England, and was closely connected with the reform movements discussed in the last chapter. Ralph Waldo Emerson, John Greenleaf Whittier, and James Russell Lowell were abolitionists. And Henry David Thoreau actually went to jail for refusing to pay taxes to a government which sanctioned slavery. Others were less directly connected with reform. Nathaniel Hawthorne explored the Puritan past with the dark lantern of imagination. His story, The Scarlet Letter, has been termed by some good critics the greatest American novel. Edgar Allan Poe, poet and writer of short stories, is mainly associated with Maryland. His tales were out of space, out of time. He excelled in the weird, the macabre, and was virtually the inventor of the detective story. Another excellent story, a short story, written was was Washington Irving, author of Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. With less artistry, but making freer use of American material, James Fenimore Cooper celebrated the frontiersman and the native Indian. Less noticed in their own time were Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, superficially a seafaring story, but containing a symbolic study of a man's search for the infinite. And Emily Dickinson, whose imaginative poetry was established mainly after her death, published after her death. Probably the most popular poets of the time were David Wadsworth Longfellow, the best of the narrative poets, who turned to American and Scandinavian antiquity for his themes. In his Hiawatha, he combined both the substance of Indian folklore and the form of the Finnish Kalevala. And William Cullen Bryant, the poet of nature. Distinctly different from these was Walt Whitman, the first great American to use free verse, not only without rhyme, but with irregular rhythm. His Leaves of Grass, symbolizing American democracy, surprised, and at first offended, a public accustomed to more conventional poetry. Americans made their mark in history also. Eminent among these were Francis Parkman, who specialized in colonial French America, William Prescott, who did a similar service for Spanish colonization, and John Lothrop Motley, who chronicled the rise of the Dutch Republic. Let's see if there's more, or if that was it. Nope. Okay, that was it. I'm just making sure. Yeah, American literature really gets its start in the 1800s. Of course, America didn't really exist before that much so. So you're going to have this. But yeah, there's a lot of writers, and there's more here that they didn't even mention, obviously. One, because we're talking about the 19th century specifically, but two, because there's also authors who they maybe just didn't have time for in this. But there's a lot of great American authors, and American literature is much bigger now, obviously, than it was back then. But even then, you could see America was establishing itself um, with literature. A lot of these guys wrote for a lot of different reasons. You have the abolitionists, you have just the simple writers. Out of all of these, I would say the most well known today that they talked about is either Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, or Edgar Allan Poe. Um, Edgar Allan Poe is very, very well known today as well. But hard to know. Hard to know who would be the most popular. But yeah, these individuals all still made their mark in history, and you can still read their books today. Of course, they still exist. That's one nice thing. You can always go back and read them. They will forever live in their writings. But now let's get into the pictures. So the top left here was Washington Irving was a journalist, author, satirist, and man of society, known for his wit, humor, and romanticism. He also was active in politics and diplomacy, serving as an attaché and later minister to Spain. Yeah, you got to remember a lot of these writers have become kind of important. Um, like this guy, for instance, comes an attaché to Spain. That's a pretty big deal. And you kind of want a writer in that. They have a way of forming words and talking that, especially if he is a little bit more humorous, might get people on your side more. It's always good to have something like that. At the left here is Edgar Allan Poe, poet, critic, and short story writer. Poe's writings also a little bit more dark, somewhat. I would say he probably influenced quite a lot of what became eventually dark fantasy and things like that, especially if it comes from the United States. So, for instance, people like H.P. Lovecraft probably were somewhat influenced by Poe. But very, very interesting author. At the top right, I believe they mean here. Just making sure. Because sometimes they have, yeah, okay. What the heck? Yeah, sometimes they have all these in very little goofy ways. I believe they mean this guy here is Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of the greatest American literary figures of the 19th century. He was most noted for his portrayal of New England Puritanism. Yeah, a lot of our views on New England and stuff like that during of the past come from some of these writers, specifically him. It'd be interesting to see how we would view that stuff without these guys. Hard to know. Above, so I believe right here is where they mean. Maybe. It's hard to know. I don't know. They have this is kind of confusing. As you can see, it says top right. So I don't know if they mean this individual or this one who I just read. Ah, we'll find out eventually, right? If any of you know, let me know. It really helps out. I don't necessarily know these guys by picture alone. But above is Ralph Waldo Emerson, the essayist and poet, was one of the founders of transcendentalism. Oh boy, as my English starts to collapse at that word, transcendentalism. There we go. Very obviously important guy. Has a lot of big parts that we talked about in the last chapter. His influence on that, obviously, very, very important. At the top here is Walt Whitman, the master of free verse. Yeah, free verse. Not something that's looked at as weird today, but back then it would have been seen as a little bit more weird, just because of how individuals uh, had poetry to begin with back then. So just a little odd. At the center here is James Fenimore Cooper, the author of historical romance and adventure. Interesting looking guy, I would say, but definitely important. You gotta have those. Um, and most literature, we think of literature today, where a lot of this stuff is very common, but you gotta remember, things like this maybe weren't as common as they are now. And at the bottom here is Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick. Obviously, Moby Dick, very, very important, very great story. Been used to death, but still very great. And then at the far picture here is a typical American whaler of his time. Opposite far right. Yeah, I believe they mean this. But yeah, typical American whaler. There's a lot of whaling ships at this time, mostly for oil. We don't think about it now, but whale oil was very common. This is before crude oil really took off. It was very common back then. But with that, that's going to do it for this video. If you guys liked the video, leave a like. If you have any ways I can improve these videos, leave a comment down below. I always appreciate your feedback. And as always, subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thank you.